Let's chat about the Trump tariff initiatives. What should we keep in mind with that?
So, Trump has proposed a 10% tax on all imports and an additional 60% tax on imports from China. He's also talked about taking that 10% rate to 20% and potentially imposing a host of other tariffs on various imports that we get from different countries. Now, the way that he talks about tariffs makes it sound like he would be imposing a tax on China or a tax on the EU, requiring those governments to pay money to the US Treasury. He also greatly overstates how much revenue could be raised by tariffs. At one point, he floated replacing the entire individual income tax with tariffs, which is mathematically impossible. He also talks about tariffs as if they would have no effects on people or businesses in the United States. And so I think it's good to take each of those in turn and figure out what really goes on when the US imposes tariffs. So, tariffs will harm businesses and workers and consumers across both countries or economies involved. And if we back up for a second and think about why, that's because when we trade with other businesses and other countries, that creates a net benefit for both countries. By specializing in things that we have a comparative advantage in, we get gains from trade. If you put a tax on trade and reduce trade, you get a mirror effect. Instead of getting gains from trade, you lose those gains. And so it creates a net cost for both economies involved. To clarify some of the points that Trump usually mentions about tariffs, first, they are not a tax that's imposed on China or on the EU. They are a tax on the person or the firm importing the good into the United States. Of course, that's the legal incidence. The economic burden of tariffs could be shared by others in the economy. So you could make a theoretical case that the foreign company exporting goods to the United States could bear some of the tariff burden if, in light of the tariff and how that changes supply and demand, they would be forced to lower their prices. In that way, they could bear some of the burden. But if we look at the 2018 2019 tariffs that Trump imposed, we don't find that effect at all. Instead, we find that the full burden of the tariff passed through to US import prices. So it was the people and the firms in the US buying goods from foreign businesses who had to bear the economic cost of the tariff. Now, when someone importing goods in the US bears that cost of the tariff, they too could shift the burden further. Again, depending on factors like supply and demand and how responsive people are, a business could pass some of that higher cost along to its consumers. So, final retail consumers like you and I, when we go to the store, would pay a higher price, or the business might have to eat that higher cost. So, it reduces their revenue and ultimately affects their workers. And another way that consumers can bear the burden of tariffs is if they have to switch to a higher priced domestic alternative. So, say, in light of the tariff being applied to the good, it's no longer attractive to buy that imported good. Instead, I switch to something that otherwise I wouldn't have purchased, or maybe I'm priced out of the market entirely. Those are also consumer costs associated with tariffs. So, bottom line, tariffs are not a free lunch. They are not a magic tool that we can use to make other governments pay revenue to us. They make us poorer and they make us less productive. And that inflicts pain upon our trading partners too. I think the big risk to be aware of is that in his pursuit of tariffs, Trump could offset potentially the entire benefit of the tax cuts that he's outlined.